Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Find out more at patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 357. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, I must tell you, today, more than usual, and this is a constant for me, I am grateful that you're here.
I'm grateful that you're here, too, because this would be really silly if I was talking to myself. I'd have to run around to the other side of the desk, pause thoughtfully when I heard your interesting content, run back. You know, it's kind of like playing chess with yourself. It's no real fun because you know your strategy.
Well, I'm interested to see if you can come up with a question that will stump yourself.
Oh, that's very easy. Here, I'll show you how to do it. What's the capital of North Dakota? Oh, I don't know.
Pierre.
Well,
like
see, that's why you're important.
All right, there we go. Well, this episode is part of our series where we look at national observances on a monthly basis. It's the first episode of the month, and this is coming out in November. Wow, we are almost at the end of Season 7 here on Trifles, and we are grateful to have you here as our listeners. We're going to be looking at gratitude in the canon, when Sherlock Holmes and others express their thanks for each other, for various occurrences, etc. Should be an interesting journey. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, they're available at ihose.co/trifles357. That'll take you directly to this episode on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Of course, you can listen to us wherever you get podcasts on any platform. You can even talk to your smart speaker and say, play the latest episode of Sherlock Holmes Trifles. And, well, then the algorithmic magic will happen. We could do with your algorithmic magic with respect to Patreon. All of our Patreon supporters get to listen to the shows ad-free, and they get a chance at winning a prize every month and every quarter. We do a drawing for free back issues of the Baker Street Journal on a monthly basis. We do a drawing for free annual subscriptions to the Baker Street Journal on a quarterly basis. You can support the show for as little as $1 a month, and you become eligible to participate in that contest. Check it out at the show notes or at patreon.com/trifles. Well, expressing gratitude in the canon. I mean, it seems rather logical that clients would express gratitude to Sherlock Holmes, but I think the selections that we've got here today, Bert, go a little bit wider than simply getting client thanks. What do we see over the course of the canon? Where are some interesting elements of gratitude that are expressed?
Well, you know, it's one of those things that when you begin asking this sort of question, and that's really what we do a lot on Trifles, primarily to keep ourselves amused, but also to have content to share with our listeners.
Is it working?
It is working. Well, it's working for me. It's amazing what you find. And gratitude is one of those things that was so important in Victorian culture, and it manifested itself in different ways. We've thought and talked previously about the language of the flowers, and there are flowers associated with showing gratitude in that sort of communications culture. But also it pops up all across Victorian poetry. I thought of Emily Dickinson, who wrote a poem, I Went to Thank Her, and people have thought that this was Dickinson's thanks to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's very short. She says, I went to, who had died, I went to thank her, but she slept, her bed a funneled stone, with nosegays at the head and foot that travelers had thrown. So that sort of thing is a tribute from one poet to another, expressing, gratitude for her inspiration. And that's what you find in the canon in lots of different places. It pops up in conversation. It pops up coming unusually from the mouth of Sherlock Holmes, who's someone we don't consider to be effusive about his feelings or even expressive about his feelings, but he does express gratitude. And then, of course, many people express gratitude to him.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is probably the most surprising, at least for the casual observer, is Sherlock Holmes thanking a Scotland Yarder. I mean, usually it's the other way around, where Scotland Yard is grateful for Sherlock Holmes being there, even though they don't necessarily express it. In the Naval Treaty, Inspector Forbes, and this is kind of one of those occasions similar to when Holmes expresses kind of a backhanded compliment to Watson, saying, you are not yourself. He said, you're a conductor of light. You're not necessarily luminous yourself. In other words, you help me to find my own way. And in the Naval Treaty, he's speaking with Inspector Forbes and says, anything else? And Inspector Forbes says, well, we have nothing else to go upon, no evidence of any kind. And this of course, is in the investigation at the Foreign Office. And Holmes asks, Inspector Forbes asks, have you formed a theory about how that bell rang? And Holmes says, well, I must confess that it beats me. It was a cool hand, whoever it was, to go and give the alarm like that. And he agrees, yes, it was a queer thing to do. Many thanks to you for what you have told me. If I can put the man into your hands, you shall hear from me. Come along, Watson. So it's this notion of kind of walking through the facts verbally that helps Holmes to kind of solidify his thinking, and he expresses gratitude for that.
It's so interesting to find that, because there's this general impression that is more of not as rooted in fact as one would think, that Holmes had nothing but contempt for the formal police officers, the authorized state police, because of their ineptitude. And here is a case where he is very collegial. Many thanks for what you have told me. He acknowledges the value of that. And it's interesting, this sensitivity runs all through the canon. We were talking earlier, and you had found this wonderful example in the Beryl Coronet. And this is part of the end of the case. And what's happened here is that there's a son who has been falsely accused of a theft when, in fact, he was working hard to protect his father's interests. And so as Holmes is explaining what really happened, he says, you then roused his anger. You then roused your son's anger by calling him names at a moment when he felt that he had deserved your warmest thanks. And so here, Holmes, a couple of things going on here. One is this: it's just a lovely little note in this scene, but also it's another indication of Holmes' perception and empathy and understanding of motivation and feeling that you tend to ignore or doesn't tend to be characteristic of Sherlock Holmes when he's discussed.
That's a good point. And, understanding the, human nature and what people might be going through in a particular situation. And Holmes, I think, does this really well as he places himself on the opposite side as those accusing a criminal or at least an alleged criminal, and is able to look at the same set of facts from a completely different perspective. And we become so rooted in what we know, what we perceive, or at least what we think to be true, that it becomes difficult then for us to extricate ourselves and look at it from the other perspective. And I think this idea of circumstantial evidence, we hear this echoed as well in the Boscombe Valley mystery, when Holmes says, well, circumstantial evidence is tricky. You can look at it one way, come out with one set of conclusions, and then look at it from a completely opposite way and get an entirely different set of conclusions. So you can only imagine Alexander Holder, the banker here in Beryl Coronet, who has accused his son, and now who Holmes tells his son was actually trying to rescue the coronet from being stolen. Can you even imagine the horror and the shame that he as a father must have felt then, having wrongly accused his son? It's one of these minor threads in the canon where Conan Doyle hints at something with some wonderful dialogue and descriptions that if you were in Alexander Holder's shoes, you can just imagine how he might have been feeling.
Yes, and it's also indicative of the fact that Conan Doyle, if we want to talk for a moment about the author here, created in Alexander Holder a character who was out of his depth from the moment you see him, and for whom the author has a little thinly veiled contempt that's perhaps not so thinly veiled.
Yeah. Well, you have to imagine that after banging your head against the wall, literally banging your head against the wall, there might be some after effects.
Yeah.
Well,
didn't improve his cognition.
It did not. Well, let's see if we can improve our cognition by taking this quick break and hearing a word from our sponsor.
When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today.
Okay, we're back, and thankful to be back as well, talking about gratitude and thanks in the canon.
Yes, and it pops up everywhere, and there's a charming example of it that's just a throwaway, and something that I had not, if I'd ever noticed it, I had forgotten in the canon. The case of the Sussex vampire begins with this very odd letter that Holmes receives in Baker Street from Morrison, and Dodd, who are forwarding on to Holmes. They are tea brokers in the Mincing Lane. And, the inquiry of, no, they're not tea brokers. Who are Morrison, and Dodd?
They're the ones who
Ferguson is
they were the machinery folks.
Oh, that's right.
Right?
That's right. This very strange letter.
Yes.
And they're passing on Robert Ferguson. That's Ferguson, who's the tea broker, and his strange inquiry about vampires. And they basically forward this on to Holmes, and this is the perplexing way that the Sussex vampire begins. But at the end of it, Watson says, "I've only one further note for this case. It is the letter which Holmes wrote in final answer to that with which the narrative begins." And so Holmes sends a note back. And it reads, Baker Street, November 21st, Re-Vampires. Sir, referring to your letter of the 19th, so it's 2 days later, I beg to state that I've looked into the inquiry of your client, Mr. Robert Ferguson of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers of Mincing Lane, and that the matter has been brought to a satisfactory conclusion. With thanks for your recommendation. I am, sir, faithfully yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Now, do you think he sent that thank you note as a potential, let's say, keeping open the lines of communication such that he might get additional referrals from Morrison and Dodd?
Well, yes, it's from a marketing standpoint that these sorts of referrals are vital to the success of an enterprise, no less that of Sherlock Holmes.
I'd be interested to see if later on they received inquiries that involved, maybe the Wessex werewolf or the the Hertfordshire mummy or something like that.
Yeah, well, Halloween, this time of the year is exactly the time to be exploring that.
Yeah, well, as long as we're on notes of thanks, one of the interesting ones, and I think this gets a little more attention simply because it's at the opening paragraph of the Golden Pince-Nez. Watson tells us about Holmes being quite busy. And I think this is set in 1895. It's a very busy year for Holmes. But one important case that he took on came with a thank you note. He writes, "As I turn over the pages, I see my notes upon the repulsive story of the Red Leech and the terrible death of Crosby the banker. Here I also find an account of the Addleton tragedy and singular contents of the ancient British barrow. The famous Smith-Mortimer succession case also comes within this period, and so does the tracking and arrest of Huret, the boulevard assassin, an exploit which won for Holmes an autographed letter of thanks from the French president and the Order of the Legion of Honor." Well, that's quite the thank you note.
It is, as well as the Order of the Legion of Honor. Now, this is a rare case of intersection among Conan Doyle's characters because it was also Brigadier Gerard who received the Legion of Honor from Napoleon at the end of one of his adventures. So here's Sherlock Holmes and Brigadier Etienne Gerard, both receiving the Legion of Honor.
I like that. Well, why don't we go from notes of thanks to votes of thanks? There's an interesting thread between three stories. Now let's start with Black Peter. We're at the point where Holmes has discovered who pinned Black Peter to the wall with the harpoon. Surprise, it was another whaler, another harpooner, Patrick Cairns. And he expresses to everyone the reason behind what he did and how he really had no regrets. And quite frankly, he thought he deserved some thanks for it. He says, well, when I came to examine the box, I found there was no money in it and nothing but papers that I wouldn't dare to sell. I lost my hold on Black Peter and was stranded in London without a shilling. There was only my trade left. I saw these advertisements about harpooners and high wages, so I went to the shipping agents and they sent me here. That's all I know. And I say again that if I killed Black Peter, the law should give me thanks, for I saved them the price of a hempen rope. How much is that worth, by the way?
Well, in Victorian money, would probably be, I don't know, not more than £1, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, that isn't too much, is it?
No, maybe 50, maybe 10 shillings for a hempen rope.
Yeah, so he thought he deserved some thanks for that.
Yeah, and then there's another one, that's also connected to murderous conversations and evil intents. It's in Valley of Fear, and it's where we hear the dialogue among the people in the valley and the supposedly evil McMurdo. It was an empty house which had been torn down by the gunpowder, and the grim old color sergeant of the war was still teaching discipline to the miners of Iron Dyke. "Leave him to me," said McMurdo. "He's my man, and I'll get him sure if I have to wait a year for him." And then a vote of thanks and confidence was passed in full lodge. And so, for the time, the matter ended, but within a few weeks, it was reported in the papers that Wilcox had been shot at from an ambuscade. It was an open secret that McMurdo was still at work upon his unfinished job. But there you have a vote of thanks. A vote of thanks goes round the table. A vote of thanks and confidence.
And that's interesting because you wonder about the lodge, if they kept written records, if there would, let's read back the minutes from the previous meeting, well, we voted to thank McMurdo.
Yeah.
And boy, if those minutes were ever discovered by the authorities, well, then you've got the whole record of what happened there.
Yeah.
An official vote of thanks. Well, similarly, another evil kind of person. It seems when you do away with evil people, you ought to be thanked in the canon. In the Red Circle, we find Black Gorgiano has been stabbed to death, and it is who's the inspector in the Red Circle? I'm forgetting. Is it?
It's the American.
Yeah. Mr. Leverton of the Pinkertons American Agency.
Yeah, there we are.
So Pinkerton.
Leverton or Leverton, right?
Yeah. Leverton. So he says, "Well, Mr. Gregson," looking across at the official, "I don't know what your British point of view may be, but I guess that in New York, this lady's husband will receive a pretty general vote of thanks."
Yes. Well, another evildoer is shuffled off the planet to the general satisfaction of all who knew him.
Yeah. Well, as we round the bend here, why don't we take a look at when emotion played into gratitude? It seems that when Holmes and others find themselves in an emotional state, they are apt to express their gratitude for those around them. And I think Holmes, in a couple of cases, is pretty astounding. But why don't we start with what is I think this is probably my favorite scene in all of the Sherlock Holmes canon, and that is in The Six Napoleons. You want to set us up?
Oh, sure. This is wonderful scene, and you're absolutely right. It's if I had to pick one scene from the canon, because it's so illustrative about the emotional undercurrent and the reality of these people and how they behave, which is what's missing in other detective stories by other novelists. And this has come home to me recently because I have an old copy of a Strand magazine that does not have anything with Sherlock Holmes in it. And when you read some of the other fiction that the Strand magazine in that era was bringing forward, and the plots and the way the characters express themselves, you really realize how extraordinary Sherlock Holmes was. But here in The Six Napoleons, the case is solved and Holmes has had this dramatic reveal. It's like a magic trick. And here Lestrade speaks, "I've seen you handle a good many cases, Mr. Holmes, but I don't know that I ever knew a more workmanlike one than that. We're not jealous of you at Scotland Yard. No, sir. We're very proud of you. And if you come down tomorrow, there's not a man from the oldest inspector to the youngest constable who wouldn't be glad to shake you by the hand. And Holmes, is sort of stunned by this expression of emotion. Thank you, said Holmes. Thank you. And this was beautifully done in the Granada series. And as he turned away, says Watson, it seemed to me that he was more nearly moved by the softer human emotions than I had ever seen him.
Yeah, that is so well done. And as you say in Granada, Jeremy Brett turns in a fine performance there where he kind of goes from this diffident and business-like thank you to the second thank you that's softening and that you can tell he's been touched. Really something. Well, speaking of Holmes having been touched, there's a couple of instances here where his gratitude is brought out. In the Three Garadebs, we're at the climax of the story. Holmes and Watson are lying in wait, watching Killer Evans excavate under the house for his printing press plates, and they surprise him. And Watson writes, in an instant he had whisked out a revolver from his breast and fired 2 shots. I felt a sudden hot sear as if red-hot iron had been pressed to my thigh. There was a crash as Holmes's pistol came down upon the man's head. I had a vision of him sprawling upon the floor with blood running down his face, while Holmes rummaged to him for weapons. Then my friend's wiry arms were around me, and he was leading me to a chair. You're not hurt, Watson. For God's sake, say that you are not hurt. It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time, I caught a glimpse of a great heart, as well as of a great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation. Really was quite something.
Yeah, beautiful. That expression of affection and care from Holmes to Watson. Very nice. Well, and then the last one is in The Devil's Foot, the last one that we've chosen to discuss today, the last one in The Devil's Foot. And what's going on here is Holmes has found a substance at the scene of the crime that he believes contributed to the death of one of the principals. And this, of course, is the Victorian era, when if you were of a scientific mind and you found something that you thought was dangerous, the most logical thing to do would be to ingest some of it to see what it did to you. And, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle did that himself in his medical studies and other practices when he was tinkering around to try to figure out how much of a particular substance would render him completely incapacitated. And here, Holmes has done a demonstration which almost took the life of himself and the life of Watson. And when he's out in the clean air recovering, he says, "Upon my word, Watson," said Holmes at last with an unsteady voice, "I owe you both my thanks and an apology. It was an unjustifiable experiment, even for oneself, and doubly so for a friend. I am really very sorry." And again, this is similar to the Garadebs. I answered with some emotion, for I have never seen so much of Holmes's heart before. It's my greatest joy and privilege to help you. And Watson has saved his life, basically, by dragging him out of that room.
Right. It's interesting that the roles are reversed here, where one is caring for the other who is in an injured state. But in both cases, it's Holmes who is expressing the kind of the heartfelt emotion here. I find that interesting. Well, my thanks to you, Bert, for making this just a trifle
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Well, Mr. Holmes, I've seen you handle a good many cases in my time, but I don't know that I ever knew a more workmanlike one than this. We're not jealous of you, you know, at Scotland Yard. Oh, sir, we're proud of you. And if you come down tomorrow, there's not a man from the oldest inspector to the youngest constable who wouldn't be glad to shake you by the hand.
Thank you.